Hello friends, welcome back to the next lecture. So far we have introduced you to urban transportation networks, the urbanization in general, how vehicles have increased, how motorization rates have increased, and we have looked at certain specific issues in urban transport. In this lecture, we are going to continue looking at some challenges in the urban transportation system. We will look at legal and regulatory challenges, how there are different institutional frameworks within which urban transport has to operate, which poses certain challenges to it, the labor force or the human resource challenges in public transportation, the lack of data or the lack of integrated data in case of urban transportation systems, and also comprehensive design standards or the lack of it. So, we will look at these aspects in this lecture. So, when we start looking at the regulatory structure of urban transportation systems, we see that there is no central or there is no one legislation that comprehensively addresses the urban transport requirements of Indian cities, right. So, there are multiple different legislations that govern different types of transportation systems, but there is not one that kind of comprehensively stitches everything together and makes it one coherent document. And several times what happens is that a transportation system often operates along a road or along a corridor which crosses several jurisdictional boundaries. So, when that happens, then you are left to deal with different types of regulations across different boundaries, which then makes it even more difficult to comply with them, right. So, for example, if a national highway is crossing two state boundaries, then there may be some regulations in one state which may be less stringent, while the truck is entering into the next state and the regulations there may be more stringent. So, the truck company or the truck operator, for example, has to keep in mind these various regulations while the company is transporting different goods. So, this is some of the regulatory challenges that a transportation system poses to various companies. For example, in the other case, when we look at the Delhi Metro, you will see that the operations, there is an act or there is a law called the Delhi Metro Operations and Maintenance Act that provides for the operation and maintenance and to regulate the working of metro railway in the city of Delhi. Similarly, there was a law that was enacted for Kolkata, which was an adjunct to the Indian Railways Act. Apart from these two, there are other laws, other older laws such as the Tramways Act of 1886, which are in effect in other metro areas. But then you see that these are again only laws that govern metro rail. The laws that govern the construction of roads or highways are different. So, suddenly when you are dealing with construction of a metro railway, then you have to comply by maybe the local regulations of highways or roads in that city, whereas the operations and maintenance act can be carried out as per this act. So, you see the multiplicity of not only the acts, the jurisdictions, the different players that are involved in managing these transportation systems makes this a very complex phenomenon. The requirements of other modes of mass rapid transit such as BRT, LRT, monorails do not have any legislation to support it. Currently, if you were to implement a monorail, which I believe in India only Mumbai has the monorail system, there are no specific regulations that are in place that govern the operations or construction of this. So, these are all special cases of implementation of these modes, and if you were to implement it in a different city, then you would create a special case there as well. So, there is a need for a umbrella legislation, so that many of these things can be coordinated very well. But now when it comes to transportation and other aspects such as land use or environment, then that becomes a whole other issue, right. So, if transportation impacts the environment, should the transportation agency comply by only the transportation regulations, transportation related regulations, or do they have to also comply with the overall environmental regulations, only a part of which only deals with transport. So, you see, when transport is such a infrastructure system that cuts across different geographies, that cuts across different disciplines, that cuts across different administrative jurisdictions, that when you are framing regulations for this, it is a challenge, and which has to be overcome over the years. The relative weak enforcement of these existing laws is another issue, right. So, many people would say that there are enough regulations in place, but the enforcement of them becomes an issue. We see it often in urban transportation, especially urban passenger transportation systems, that regulations are violated. When they are violated, when fees are imposed on them, those fees are also not very high. So, the users or the traveler does not seem to mind paying that fee over and over again, and is not the fee does not act as a deterrent to the user of the transportation system. So, not only is the enforcement not very consistent, but also the penalty is not very steep, and these are also contributing factors which are not enabling a change in behavior of the people using the transportation network. So, there is a need to look into those matters as well. For example, we all know wearing helmet is essential to saving your life if you get into an accident, but many of us flout that rule while we are riding, and only very recently many cities or states have come up with stricter enforcement of that regulation, right. The enforcement of that regulation was very lax. So, many of us did not change our behavior. So, maybe now some of the cities are enforcing it more in a strict and consistent manner, and that is why the behavior of the users is also changing. The other thing is fragmented institutional framework, right. Now, there are always multiple agencies that are at different levels that frame these either frame the laws or have jurisdiction over the transport agencies. So, for example, transport is usually considered to be a state subject, but in certain jurisdictions it also becomes a local subject, right. In certain cases it becomes a local subject. So, now when there are different local laws and then there is different state laws, then it becomes difficult to comply with these, and then enforcement also becomes difficult. So, there is a need to develop these legislations in a well coordinated manner. For example, according to the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution, urban development, which includes urban transport, is a state list, is on the state list. While in some states, transportation department undertakes urban transportation planning. In other states, urban development or the municipal administration at the urban level does it. So, when a municipality is implementing something and a state is implementing the same thing at in other cases, so then it becomes it becomes a challenge to oversee these things. It becomes a challenge to implement consistent regulation throughout the system. So, that is one of the challenges. Also, there is absence of any effective coordinating agency where urban transport and land use can be integrated. So, now this is always a challenge not only in India, but also worldwide. Land use and urban transportation go hand in hand. So, when we say that, what we mean is that if the use on any particular piece of land changes, its impact on the transportation network also changes. So, for example, if you have land on which you are currently having a single story independent house, so the number of trips or the number of vehicles that would be generated out of that house is significantly different from if you say, for example, now convert that land into a and convert that land into something that where you build a multi-storied apartment complex. Now, so both are residential, so you would not you are not changing any zoning on it, but you are changing the land use, and with this change in land use, now the apartment complex may have multiple families living in it, each family may have multiple vehicles. So, the number of vehicles coming out of the same parcel of land will now change. So, that will differently impact the transportation network. So, this is what we mean to say when we say that there is a strong relationship between land use and transportation. Now, when we talk about the institutional framework, now land use may be not governed by will not be governed by any of the transportation legislation or laws or regulations, and so there is always a miscommunication between these two agencies as to how to well coordinate between the two. So, only a few urban areas around the world have come about or have come around to solving this problem, and most of us are otherwise grappling with this issue. Next comes the human resource challenge. Transportation as a field for employment has been always there. Many of them are employed, especially when a new highway is built, new railroads are built, new airports are built. So, it does generate a lot of employment, but however, what happens is these are one-time jobs. So, the labor force, you cannot use the same labor force, for example, who has built a particular airport in a city to now then take it all the way across the country to build another airport at a different state in a different city. You usually don't do it. So, what happens is the skill set that the local people develop, they can be only used once or twice. Highways, that is why, are more popular source of generating income or livelihood, because you may expand the highway and your local knowledge always helps you generate a lot of jobs. But when it comes to urban transportation, other than the construction of any highways or construction of any structures related to transport network, the other sort of human resources are in a very nascent stage of development currently. For example, how do you build efficient metro rail system? So, we often hire help from outside countries or different nations to help us build these sophisticated systems, and sometimes also multinational companies help us operate these systems. So, when it comes to skill set that is required to manage newer age urban transportation systems, we still have to develop the human resources for it. Of course, it's an ongoing process. Once you have human resource, you have to skill them and reskill them so that they are always up to date with the newer technologies, and that is how we can keep up our development module. Most of the state and city level agencies have suffered from overstaffing of untrained, unskilled manpower, right. So, when you look at some of the older institutions in transportation, such as the Public Works Department and so on and so forth, you would see that they employ a large number of people. However, their skills have not been redeveloped or polished over the years. So, they are still at using older technologies, not keeping pace with the new technologies that are available, which in turn affects the quality of work that is being conducted. So, that kind of a lag, or that kind of a lack of skill development and reskilling can be noticed in some of these older agencies. The next challenge in the transportation sector is of data. What you can infer from that is that there is data available, but data is in silos. So, and data is not available very easily in digitized format, especially in the case of India, right. So, although the slide says absence of data, but you are to interpret that as absence of coordinated, easily available digitized data, right. So, if I were to want to access the data of a different city, it would be very difficult for me to sitting in another city to access that data easily via, say, an internet or something else. Of course, the data would be made available to me if I went to the proper channel, wrote certain application letters, and moved certain files, and I am sure we would obtain the data within a month or so, but there is a lag in getting that data, and then the quality of data is the next thing, right. So, if it takes you a lot of time just to get hold of the data, then you have to make sure whether you are receiving the right type of data that you want, and what is the quality of that data. Is there a lot of noise within the data? Is the data clean? Are the parameters that you are looking for available in that data? Is the data very recent, or is the data very old? So, all of these issues are there with transportation related works. However, with the advent of big data sources, now there are newer regulations that are being formed, which are enabling different agencies to get real time data and use that data for effective governance, so that the operations of the urban transportation systems improve. So, you could overall say that there is data that is available, but what lacks is the timely availability of quality data that is digitized and coordinated, right. Like we said, reliability and accuracy of the data is something that has a lot to be improved upon, and availability of data from one agency to the other. So, one agency might be doing a great job on keeping up with all its data elements, but the adjoining agency or the adjoining administrative unit may not have any data. So, when you are looking for data at a corridor level or at a regional level, then you would only have data for certain segments maybe, and you do not have data for the entire segment. So, that does not help you much in understanding the or in developing efficient policies for improving the operations of the transportation system. Of course, the National Urban Transport Policy, which was formed in 2006, identified Institute of Urban Transport India to be developed as a national institute to build the database repository. So, there is steps that are being taken. Now you have a database, a digital database where many of the agencies are putting up their data and is easily downloadable. So, efforts are being made which are helping researchers and analysts to actually data crunch, number crunch, and bring out solutions to these things. You should also be aware of certain data uses that are being thought of in India, such as urban observatories, which are implemented at a city level scale. In some of the cities, for example, have cameras at all of their intersections, right. So, these cameras generate huge amount of data and there is a central control room where people are monitoring all of the intersections and crunching the data that is coming out of these cameras to understand real time traffic conditions, right. So, they can predict that if there is a accident that has happened downstream, what is its impact going to be on the upstream traffic. So, if you have such kind of continuous data, real time data coming in from live camera feeds, you can always convert that into real time information. So, the data needs are always growing. So, lastly, there is a challenge when it comes to comprehensive design standards, right. IRC codes are available for different types of design, that sets out different types of design guidelines and technical standards for constructions of roads and bridges. However, a critical feature is that the IRC codes are not adhered to for urban road development. They are not mandatory for municipalities, right. So, you have these set of regulations, you have these set of codes, but they are not made mandatory. So, when they are not made mandatory, people usually bypass the standards in the name of cost saving and often construct substandard roads or substandard bridges or structures, and this is often this is never desirable. So, this is only about IRC has been developed over years and has nearly been perfected in many cases for the design of roads and bridges. However, now the new age transportation systems such as metro rails or BRTs or bicycle paths or bicycle tracks. So, these are all new age transportation systems that do not have design standards. So, you would always question when you question a system not working. We have to remember that due to the lack of certain standardized designs, maybe the system was bound to fail. So, are we developing certain systems just by looking at standards internationally and trying to build them here? So, many times such systems may not work if they do not have indigenous standards which are catering to the local conditions. So, there is a need to develop comprehensive design standards when it comes to the new age transportation systems, and also there is a need to implement such design standards or make them enforceable so that local municipalities or states follow them. So, this is what we have already discussed about how the urban roads are not mandated to follow IRC, and hence many times they build substandard roads. In the absence of urban road standards, some city led initiatives have been taken up, notably in Delhi and Bangalore. So, there are different instances where for example, along urban roads there are no design standards that take into consideration the street vendors that are on footpaths, right. So, it is very easy to say that we should remove all the street vendors from our footpaths, but these vendors, for them the spot along the footpath is where they earn their livelihood. So, it is a tough call to say that you take your livelihood somewhere else. So, a way to deal with it is to have sidewalk design standards that provide for that provide spaces to these to these vendors, so that they can also earn their livelihood, and at the same time the pedestrians also do not have any issues while walking along the sidewalk. So, such integrated, such coordinated design standards are needed to meet today's real challenges in our cities, rather than following some design standards in foreign nations or older design standards that are not the case in the current day and age. It is always good to have cognizance of international design standards, but to implement them blindly is not always recommended. You have to take into cognizance what are the local conditions or the Indian conditions before you implement them. So, in conclusion, what we looked today is the second set of challenges that are faced by the urban transportation systems. We looked at the different legal and jurisdictional hurdles. We looked at how there are multiplicity of institutions which have to be complied with while you are developing these transportation systems. The issue of labor or human resources in urban transportation, how they have to be skilled from time to time so that they keep up with the new technologies. And finally, we looked at the need for various design standards, coordinated design standards that actually look at the existing Indian urban situation. Thank you for your attention.